Hello class, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be a narrated PowerPoint presentation for chapters 4 through 7. Next slide. Our first chapter is chapter 4, which deals with collection. The image that you see there is a picture of a Russian spy that was meeting with an FBI undercover agent. And the reason why I put that in there is as you'll see as we talk about human intelligence, that is one of the most important aspects of the various INTs, or intelligence collection methods. So we'll discuss that in this chapter along with several other key terms. Just remember, collection is the very heart of the intelligence endeavor, and that includes relative to risk and resources. It's also the most expensive. This is where you're going to spend most of your money from an intelligence perspective, the organizational perspective. But it's crucial. Without the good collection of information that can be converted into intelligence, it'll reduce our decision advantage and our understanding of the world around us. Next slide. I always like to throw this slide in there, even though it's not in the book in this manner, is the requirement or the mission. And that, in the new intelligence process, they kind of leave this step out. But essentially, if you're working in intelligence, you're serving your customer. Your customer in this case could be retired FBI Director Robert Mueller, the President Obama, or at the right, he just recently retired, Admiral McRaven, who was head of the Special Forces community. These gentlemen have needs from a policy perspective relative to the gathering of intelligence. They would set the requirements, and of course, as they set these requirements, the analyst, the intelligence agency itself, would go back and forth and discuss exactly what they need and that sort of thing, so they can put together a plan, which is called a collection plan. But we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Next slide. Collection again, the stage, again, is the heart, most expensive. It's ongoing. It never stops. I don't care if you're working for the CIA, the FBI, or you're a criminal investigator in a local or state police department. You need to collect information that can be converted to intelligence, to either at the macro level, at the CIA level, to address our national security needs, and it could go down to the bottom level for a detective or an investigator that's working a homicide or a robbery case, trying to collect good, actionable information that can be turned into actionable intelligence to help them do their job. It's handled, collection is handled by a wide variety of professionals, and we'll discuss those as we move forward. And normally what I've learned is it's not that there's not enough information. A lot of times just the sheer volume of information could be very, very overwhelming. And so one of the challenges for intelligence analysis, and also the collection aspect, is picking out the information that's crucial. And if you can actually get too much information, and which can result in a flawed intelligence product once the product is completed, the process is completed, and the request, the report, whatever you want to call it, the report goes to the leader who requested it, the person that was that provided the requirement to start with. Next slide. And before we get into this particular slide, I also want to remember when I'm talking about information, the old adage, they talk about it in the book, garbage in, garbage out. If your information coming in is poor, if it's not very good, if it's not properly vetted, then your product is also going to be flawed. And that's one thing that's very critical. And in the book they talk about Curveball, that was his code name. And this is individual was the source or the asset that the United States and the intelligence community relied on relative to his information that ultimately led to the invasion of Iraq after 9/11. And of course the requirement was pushed on down by leadership of the nation did Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction. So in the collection process, they identified and recruited this particular source, whose code name was Curveball, and he claimed to have worked at an Iraq biological weapons lab, etc. But the information he was providing was that yes, there is a viable WMD threat from Iraq, and much of his information was used to justify that invasion. Now, interesting enough, and we'll talk about vetting in a few minutes, Germany actually warned that this guy was not reliable, and the question then comes to mind, because we know that those caches of weapons of mass destruction were never found in Iraq, despite all the efforts to find them. So obviously the information provided from this source was not reliable. And as it turned out later, he actually admitted to it, that he had lied to the United States and other allies that were involved relative to the WMD program in Iraq. And he was he had been exiled from Iraq. He was an Iraqi citizen, and he had a personal vendetta against the current regime. And so as a result of his vendetta, and the intelligence community for the United States not doing a very good job of vetting this source, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. By not vetting or verifying the information, obviously the foundation for the invasion was flawed based on it. So you can see what impact putting all your eggs in one basket can have, and in this case it was disastrous for the United States. Next slide. When we talk about source vetting, thinking about Curveball, there's things that you can do. And I worked with a lot of informants and assets when I was an agent. And one of the things we always did, and in reality, you need these people. You need informants. You need assets. The terminology changes whether you're in the criminal area or whether the intelligence field. But you need people that provide you information. But it's also important that you vet these people, go through a process to validate the information that they're providing you. So you don't do something like invade a country or execute or get a search warrant or things of that nature on information that's not been properly vetted. And how do we do this? We can do surveillance. Let's say a person comes forward and they say that they have access to valuable information on our investigation. Then we can put a surveillance on that person, watch him, who he goes, where he goes, who he contacts, to see whether or not this is a person that actually has access to the information that he says he has. We also, one of the things that we did use this a lot, and I found this to be a successful method, was use other sources, maybe other assets that knew this individual, and validate the information through them. We also have polygraph examinations. They call it a lie detector test, but essentially a polygraph, what it does is it measures changes in a person's body functions, their blood pressure, their heartbeat, their galvanic skin response, and these are the same responses that normally can be detected in individuals that are not telling the truth. So the polygraph's a very effective tool, especially in this type of work. But still, vetting, you can vet a person, and you can do the best that you can in trying to validate the information he has, and that is truthful, and still have problems, down the road. Collection is not the job, and source vetting, that's not the job of the analyst. That's the job of the individual in the field. From the CI perspective, this would be your operational officers that are working out of the various embassies overseas. And from a law enforcement perspective, it would be your detectives, your special agents at the federal level. Obviously, it's a term they call all source. And let me just back up for one other second, too, before we leave this slide. Denial and deception are key elements of every intelligence service. So if you're working at a national security level, targeting a foreign country, they have been also trained in what we call tradecraft, and to provide plausible deniability, using deception in the information they provide, etc. So these things have all got to be looked at very, very careful. They talk about it the Whitey Bulger case, and this was in, you can read it yourself on page 82, box 4.1. This is an individual that was involved in organized crime in New England, and he ultimately, he was a criminal involved in some very serious crimes, but he ultimately became an informant for the FBI, and what they called a top echelon performer for the FBI, providing information primarily about the New England Mafia. And ultimately his handler, and if you have informants, you're going to have an agent as the handler. His handler got too close to this guy and looked the other way when this individual was engaging in crime, even though he was providing information on other crime groups. This guy, meanwhile, at the same time, was committing crimes just as bad. And when he was later indicted, the FBI agent who was handling him actually tipped him off to the indictment, which allowed him to escape. And they just recently captured this guy. This is going back. He was a fugitive from 1994 to 2011. So if you do handle informants, it's important that you're trained properly. You don't get too close to them. One of the problems that I saw in my career was agents that were handling female informants, and then ultimately what happens is they end up having some sort of an affair, which means they compromise their position. So you got to have the right people doing this kind of work. They talk about all source intelligence, and what that means is not just getting it from one person like a human intelligence source, trying to make decisions based on a variety of methods. It could be human intelligence, it could be signals intelligence, it could be imagery intelligence, or geospatial intelligence, using these multiple areas that allow us to understand, get a better understanding of the target and to accomplish the mission or the plan to meet the requirement that has been asked of us. And one of the key, they talk about Operation Neptune Spear, which was the operation that ended up in the death of Osama bin Laden. That was a all-source intelligence effort. You had human intelligence, you had geospatial intelligence, you know, taking pictures of the compound where he was captured. You had informants. You had surveillance that was done to identify the courier who led them to Osama bin Laden. So you had multiple factions and also multiple agencies that were involved. It was a textbook case of all-source intelligence and individuals working together. You know, before you collect information, also it's also important to have a plan. So you need to know what your ultimate goal is and set up your collection based on meeting those requirements. In other words, if it's something that deals where you don't need signal intelligence, you don't need geospatial intelligence, well, you don't need to plan for that. You just need to plan for those INTs or those methods that are useful. And I talked about Whitey Bulger. There's a picture of Whitey. Just remember, sources take years to develop sometimes. It's hard to get a really good informant or a source. And so sometimes you will get a requirement that's going to require an insider, a source, that's inside that can actually provide you the intelligence and the information you need. It might take years. It's not something you're going to turn around in a short time. And I know for a fact when I was dealing with informants or cooperating witnesses, I protected those people. The only people that knew about them were the people that had to know about them. And you owe that to them, because many times they're in a situation where if they're gathering information on really bad criminals, or if it was a national security case, you can imagine what the repercussions could be. You know, even their lives being put in danger. When we talked about Ames and all the sources that we had overseas that were cooperating in the old former Soviet Union, when Ames turned their names over, they ended up being killed and murdered. There's a difference, just so you understand, between a cooperating witness, a confidential informant, and an asset. A confidential informant normally is an individual who provides information in criminal matters, We had them as a postal inspector when I was a special agent with NCIS. The FBI has them. You want to keep this person's identity secret, and that even means not blowing his identity if he's that valuable of a source. Even if you have to lose a case or not even prosecute a case, because to do so he would be the only one who could testify. And if his value to the organization is greater than that one case, well, that's a no-brainer. An asset is like a confidential informant that provides information on national security matters. So that's what you'll see with your CIA officers. They have their assets overseas. Cooperating witness, you'll deal with many of these. These are individuals that are recruited with a specific knowledge about maybe a national security issue or maybe a crime. Maybe they're involved in the crime and they cooperate with you in return for something. A lot of times it could be a reduced sentence, something of that nature. I worked with these people all the time when I was an agent, and you will too. And they might be somebody that's making undercover buys for you because they at one time were part of that operation. And so these are, again, this is how they kind of break them down with confidential informant, asset, and cooperating witness. One other area I want you to check in the book, and I'm not going to go over it at too great a length, but when we do reports, when intelligence agencies provide reports, they attach a level to their confidence in that report. And those levels are high, moderate, and low. You can read about that at the top of page 84. But if you have high-quality information, then when you provide your report to your requester, maybe the president, maybe the CIA director, or a detective or an agent somewhere in a smaller organization, you as an analyst, as part of the intelligence in the product itself that you provide, you need to be able to provide some sort of level of confidence that you have. So if you give me something that you're not very confident, you assign it a low confidence level, then that tells me that there's only so much I can do with that information, and perhaps that's the best that you can get. But again, that's when you would have an informant whose plausibility or their truthfulness is relatively questionable. Next slide. Again, all source, we already talked about Osama bin Laden, but these are some of the things that you would use. You can see geospatial or GeoInt, which is a satellite image of the compound in the upper right. There's your, to the left there, that would be more or less your human intelligence person. That was the individual who was identified as the courier. They did a lot of work intercepting telephone communications, doing surveillance, that sort of thing, trying to find that individual. Next slide. Collection stage, again, remember, raw information that is driven by the requirements. You always need a plan. Remember, garbage in, garbage out. So if the information that's coming in to be analyzed is not properly vetted, then don't expect a quality product for your requester. And these are just a couple of pictures of, on the left there, that would be a GeoInt. It also used to be called imagery intelligence, would be like photographs, but now with the satellites, etc., they call it geospatial. And that can include a lot of things. It could essentially what you're looking at is a mapping of the Earth's surface. And then on the right you have a filing cabinet loaded with hopefully information that somebody sees as part of a search warrant. Types of intelligence collection: human intelligence. That's the oldest one. Oldest form of intelligence, collecting information from people. To a lot of agencies, including this former agent here, that was my preferred method. Number one, I always felt better if I had a pair of eyes that were looking at the suspect, or eyes that had seen a crime being committed. I had much more confidence in that. And sometimes, obviously, images and things of that nature, maps and photographs, etc., they're very valuable too. It just depends on the requirement that you're facing. But human intelligence is very, very important. One other thing that they talk about, and of course that's where a lot of your CIA agents, etc., they spend all their time overseas trying to develop assets, trying to get sources that they can use. They have to be careful of walk-ins. This is like, let's say I'm working in the U.S. Embassy in the Middle East somewhere, let's say Amman, Jordan, and somebody comes in and says that they want to work with the U.S. and provide information on the Islamic State. Well, I want to make sure I can vet this person properly. These walk-ins have to really be carefully assessed, looking at their motivations, etc., to make sure that they're not a dangle or somebody sent by a terrorist organization or a foreign government to actually penetrate your agency. So these are some of the things you have to think about when dealing with human intelligence. And it also can be very dangerous. There's a film clip that I've shown you where some CIA employees were killed in Afghanistan in 2009 by a source who actually turned out to be a double agent who was working, who ultimately he detonated a suicide bomb that killed many of the agents at that scene that were involved in that case, and especially at the time in that operation that they were using in that very dangerous part of the world. Double agents are people that are sent in by a foreign government, say for example, that remain loyal to their host government, and they provide false information, and they try to gather information on the government where they're employed now. And these jobs are not always the most glamorous. These CIA case officers that are out there collecting information, you might spend a lot of what they talk about in the book about going to boring parties or sitting in cafes trying to interview and talk to many people, hoping that you can develop somebody that has some information, some inside information or whatever in the areas that you're interested in. Maybe it be relative to, say, America's national security. Signals intelligence. When you're dealing with signal intelligence, you're dealing with electronic targets, telephones, radar, email, computers, and the like. They break it down into COMINT, which is electronic emissions, and ELINT. Computer, email, telephone intercepts would be considered communication intelligence, COMINT, whereas radar transmissions are ELINT. There's some good discussion about cryptologists, and we've talked about that before, cryptoanalysis, encryption codes, etc. And that's very critical relative to signals intelligence. In fact, when they were able to, the cryptoanalysts were able to break the German code in World War II. I saw a movie recently where it was where they were dealing with that, trying to break that code. It's estimated the war was shortened by 2 years and could have possibly saved up to 14 million people's lives by having the war cut short because of the ability of intelligence they were able to get when they broke that code. Geospatial, formerly IMINT, I've talked about that before, and that in a nutshell, photographing or otherwise imaging characteristics of the physical Earth. So there's different methods. It doesn't have to necessarily come from a spy satellite or from a plane flying overhead. With the advent of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, it's made it a lot easier to use this GOINT. Measures and signals intelligence, that's another one we talk about, and that deals a lot with measuring things such as if North Korea exploded a nuclear weapon, we would be able to measure the technical data that would indicate that yes, there's radioactive material in the area, and we can confirm that they actually did conduct a detonation. And we'll talk about financial intelligence a little bit later, and open source is what you can get anywhere on the internet or whatever. Next slide. Again, a little repeat here. Walk-ins, do they provide a danger? Yes, they are. They could be a dangle. Double agents and dangles. Source motivations are many. why people come down. Some people do it for revenge. Some people do it for money. That's normally the main thing that I've seen. And some people do it because maybe they got involved in the same crime and they're cooperating to get a lesser sentence or whatever. This is just an image. This would be the old imagery intelligence, but what we call now GeoInt. This is a picture that I took of the former president of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. And this is not classified information or anything. He was at a hotel when I was in Chad in Africa doing a training course for the State Department. He just happened to be here, and I snapped this picture. Source acquisition, there is actually a cycle. I don't believe they talk about it much in our textbook, but you would spot with human intelligence. They don't teach this cycle in the book, but I wanted to expose you to it. Spotting would be going out and trying to identify people that may be a source, assessing that person. Yeah, this is somebody that we could use. He's in the military for this foreign country. He would have access to information that would be useful to the United States. And then you actually go out and try to recruit that person. Get him to work with you and provide you information, which is not easy. And if they agree, then it would be the handling portion, which is where they're actually collecting information. And finally, you always end up terminating your source if they don't have the same access they once had, or perhaps the information they're providing is not too good. So this would just be an example of the source acquisition cycle. Signals intelligence, just some slides to kind of give you some ideas. The upper right, that's the NSA headquarters, National Security Agency. There's a picture of a satellite. Question down there, can NSA spy on Americans? No, they do not have the jurisdiction domestically. What is chatter? Chatter is when there's specific pieces of information, it could be phone calls or whatever, that are coming in, and if it could be from a target of interest. Maybe you have a couple of people that we have our targets of interest, and we're monitoring their telephone calls, or a group of people, and all of a sudden we see that chatter increase. And these are individuals that are engaged in terrorist activities that target the United States and its interest overseas. If that chatter increases and then goes dark, then many times that might mean that an operation is imminent, that has been planned, and is getting ready to be operational. GeoInt, just some sample pictures of geospatial, and again, it could be something as simple as a camera on a wall outside looking at a parking lot, or a camera in a bank. I mean, those are images, imagery intelligence, which we now call GeoInt. Very valuable source, but again, it also can be controlled by the weather. You know, if the weather's really bad and the satellite's down, then there's a time period when you don't have it. So that's when perhaps some of your other techniques, like human intelligence, will have to come into play. Just some other pictures of some of the drones that we use. Measures and signals intelligence. It could be electromagnetic spectrums. Just some sensors, like I talked about. If North Korea detonates a nuclear device, then it could be something like sensing an increase in radioactivity. It could be something that the ground, motions in the ground that have been disrupted by the explosion, things of that nature. These are very sensitive things that can be identified and can assist, and it's mostly technical data, but they also are very valuable in trying to identify certain things, and that means whether something is happening or has happened. And this could be emitted energy, nuclear, chemical, biological, magnetic properties, motion, mechanical sounds, things of that nature. When we talk about financial intelligence, terrorists have to have money to operate their, carry out their schemes. So we can cut off the funding. That's a very, very important part in the war on terror, trying to disrupt their operations because they do need money. FinCEN is the financial center. It's called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. This is where a lot of agents are that are assigned to these type of duties under one roof, and they work together relative to developing financial information that can be useful to the Joint Terrorism Task Forces and others that are out there doing cases to protect our national security. And this could be something like obtaining bank records, identifying institutions where records are kept. So it's a very important part of the overall effort to disrupt terrorist operations. Hawala is it's a real challenge for law enforcement. It's an alternative or parallel remittance system. If you look at box 4.8 on page 102, it gives a pretty good explanation. And it's been around a long time. It's used in Southern Asia and India, Pakistan, and places like that. And what's unique about it is it makes it very, very difficult to trace the source of funding of monies. And in the next slide, I believe I have it kind of explains how that works. So let me give you an example here. A Pakistani working, this comes right off the slide. A Pakistani working in New York as a taxi driver wants to send $5,000 to his brother in Karachi. He can go to a bank, but the bank is going to want him to open an account, also charge him a pretty good fee to send the money. He'll have to fill out some paperwork depending on how much cash he's providing. That would go to the Internal Revenue Service and also to FinCEN. On the other side, he can go to Hawala. He can go to a Hawala dealer, and they'll negotiate for a small fee and exchange rate. And so if he uses a Hawala dar, he would then give him that $5,000. That person would give him a code that he'll eventually give to his brother. The dealer then calls, faxes, or sends an email to another dealer in Karachi, Pakistan, and those two dealers work out an arrangement as to how the fee and how the money will be exchanged. And the Karachi dealer then arranges to have the equivalent of $5,000 delivered or available for pickup by the brother. The entire transaction takes 1 or 2 days, and there's no record of it. So let me go over it again. I have $5,000 I want to send to my brother in Pakistan. I go to the Hawala dealer here in New York. He and I work out a deal for whatever that his fee might be. I give him the $5,000 in cash. He gives me a slip of paper with a code number on it. I call my brother and give him this code number and tell him who will have his money. In the meantime, the two Hawala dars, the two dealers, they work out an arrangement as to how the individual in Pakistan will ultimately get his $5,000 back from the Hawala dealer in New York. They can work that out. It could be something down the road. It's an informal arrangement that they'll abide. It's built on trust, but they probably have worked together with each other, so they kind of keep a running tab on what each one owes. And then that dealer would then wait, and then my brother would call that dealer, and the dealer would say, well, come on down. If my brother shows him the right code number, then he would give him the $5,000. The money can change very quickly, and the paper trail is virtually impossible to follow. Open source is what you can get on the internet and printed magazines, publications, the library, or whatever. And I always like to think of intelligence as like a mosaic or a pearl. You have all these little bits and pieces, and the hard part is making them fit together and being able to see the picture. Because as the clam shows, or the oyster, you can go through 1,000,000 oysters, but if you can get that one pearl, that one piece of information that makes it all make sense, that draws that picture, that's what you're looking for. This will be Chapter 5, Barriers to Analysis. I think it's important to remember that good analysis is hard work. it's not easy to take all this information and try to connect the dots. And even though, and how can that be evidence? We have to look at the barriers to good analysis. Your good intelligence analysts have to overcome these psychological barriers, and we're going to talk about them in length. But when you look at our history, I mean, we failed to predict the Soviets would put missiles in Cuba in the 60s. We failed to predict the fall of the Soviet Union. Our intelligence community failed to foresee the 9/11 attacks, the attack at Pearl Harbor. So unfortunately, the intelligence community has had a series of failures, and many of those failures were caused by some of the things that we'll talk about today. And these are the psychological or some of the barriers that prevent the analyst from coming up with an unbiased product that is of value to the decision maker. All right, on this slide, we're going to look at some of the psychological barriers to analysis. Just remember, good analysis, again, is hard work. Analysts live in a world rife with uncertainty and ambiguity. I mean, they get bits and pieces of information from different sources. Connecting the dots is not always easy. I like the analogy of a jigsaw puzzle, and that's what it's like to be an analyst. You're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle with information that's provided. And what's important for a good, effective analysis, or a product that is useful to the decision maker, is to be to overcome the psychological barriers to analysis. We all have individual biases that are ingrained in our being, and in analysis you have to learn to overcome those. And as a matter of fact, many analysts go through training, etc., to overcome these certain biases that would affect them, that affects their ability to make a good decision. In the book they talk about rationality, bounded rationality. People often do not act rational in their decision making. In fact, we have a tendency to make quick decisions, which is called satisficing. And in making our decisions, these quick decisions, we use heuristics in our mind, or shortcuts to facilitate that rapid decision making. They can be developed over time and are strongly informed by our experiences. And as situations increase in complexity, there's a tendency for our brains to oversimplify them. So we will be making decisions based on incomplete information. So taking shortcuts in analysis can be a very negative thing relative to producing a useful product. Think about a person that buys a car. A person that goes out, shops at multiple dealerships, decides on the car he wants, compares prices, compares financing. They're making a much more informed decision, taking their time, as compared to somebody that just walks into the first car dealership they run into and buy the first car they see. Again, because they're in a hurry, they have other things. These are biases as an analyst that would be very, very negative in your ability to be objective, and also to provide a good topic. And much of this is driven, as they talk about in the book, of our perceptions, how we see the world, how we see the environment around us, and mindsets, the ways that we look at things, the world around us. They're not static. Our mindsets are formed by our education, our experience, our culture. I like the perception I like the example about environment that they give in the book, and this is important for an analyst's brains as the world changes, subtle changes around them. If you have a pot of hot boiling water and you throw a frog in it, he's immediately going to jump out. He has a quick perception of his world. But if you take that same frog, put him in warm water, and slowly turn up the heat until it starts boiling, he will not notice the change. And so that is something that an analyst, they have to be constantly aware of changes around them, the slow, subtle changes that could have a very major impact on their ability to do a good, solid analysis. One particular mindset bias that I think is really important is mirror imaging, and I think we all do this to a certain extent. It's a bias. It's everybody thinks like we do, and that's what happened in Pearl Harbor. The U.S. planners did not envision that Japanese would be so foolish as to attack the United States and our resources, but to the Japanese the attack made sense in their mind. Damage our morale, damage our navy so they could carry out other attacks in the area that they wish to conquer. And so our lack of imagination, our lack of ability and that is a bias, thinking that the Japanese would think the same way we do, ended up being a fundamental error, obviously, and the attack wasn't predicted. Now the Japanese also did some area jimming, because they were not able to envision Americans' anger and resolve in responding to Pearl Harbor. Another barrier to overcome is what they call fundamental attribution error. It's another bias, and this occurs when the behavior of others, we attribute the behavior of others to their personalities or individual skills, while undervaluing situations that may explain their behavior. Saddam Hussein would be a perfect example. He was very defiant about working with the United Nations, etc., relative to the weapons of mass destruction that he allegedly had. And so he kept up a tough face. I'm not going to cooperate with you. And why did he do that? Because he also had a relation. So he seemed to be a very non-cooperative, belligerent individual, and so they attributed that, hey, because of his personality and the way he's acting, he must have them. But all the time, they didn't take into effect that Iran, which was his mortal enemy next door, had a tense relationship, and by Iran thinking that he might have this WMD program, that might be something that proves as a detente, so they wouldn't attack Iraq or get involved in their affairs for fear. So he had to keep this up. So our analysts weren't able to. They made that fundamental attribution error. It's because of the way he was behaving. He must really have those WMD, which we now know he didn't. Let's look at another one, vividness criterion. And that's where we say the most recent information. Let me back up. With vividness criterion, we're talking about, and I like the example that they give, the information in our brain becomes prioritized due to our personal exposure, perhaps, to a location or an event. And so a bias is established. In other words, they give an excellent example in the book where two analysts travel to a foreign country. They have a great time. When they return, their boss asked them to write a report on the likelihood of this country invading their neighbor. Well, because they had such a wonderful time, the people they met were so lovely, their report downplayed the likelihood of invasion based on a bias, that vividness criterion bias that they had established because of their visit. Availability bias is something that where we attach the most credence to the information that's most easily retrieved. And the best example I can, or an example I can give you there is where you have two analysts and working in an area where they think there might be a mole. Well, one analyst had been in a department before where there had been a spy, so he would be much more willing to lend credence to information that they had one within their midst now versus somebody who had never been exposed to one. They give an example in the book that you can read. It's pretty good. And they also talk about Rick Ames. And again, two people are smokers. One had a father who died of lung cancer, whereas the other does not know anyone who ever had lung cancer. The one whose father died will normally perceive a greater probability of adverse health consequences associated with smoking rather than the other individual who had never been around it. talk a little bit about cause and effect. Oh, let me back up. Now let's move forward. Cause and effect. Just as we humans have difficulty understanding statistics, many of us are confused about cause and effect. And that's important in the world of analysis as to what causes something that, if there's an effect, we need to know what causes it. To do that, you have to look at correlation, which is the predictable relationships between two things, weather and wearing clothing, temporality, which is the cause must occur before its effect, and the example they give you is a person sticks his head out the door at night, and then he makes a decision on whether to wear a coat. Another factor is the ability to control other variables that might impact something. In one of our follow-up slides, we actually go into that, and let's do that when that slide comes. Again, it's very important to understand causes and effects. There's another barrier when we're talking about barriers to analysis. And as humans, we have difficulty understanding statistics, so many of us get confused by cause and effects. But in the intelligence world, it's very important to understand whether something causes something or not. So let's look at an example here. In theory, here's the theory, as ice cream sales increase, the rate of drowning increases. That's the effect. So the cause is the ice cream sales causes the drowning. Therefore, ice cream sales cause drowning. Correlation, yes, a predictable relationship exists between the two. Temporality, yes, and the statement the cause precedes the effect. Yet because ice cream sales go up, does that necessarily mean drowning numbers go up? That's what you have to ask yourself. So what is the unstated variable? And the unstated variable here is hot weather. So hot weather causes an increase in ice cream sales and the rate of drowning. That makes sense because people eat more ice cream during hot weather and people do more swimming. So to prove cause and effect, it must be demonstrated that only the cause made the difference. Let's look at another one. In theory, in country A, poverty causes terrorism. The correlation and temporality is not questioned. How about the ability to control variables? Well, the most reliable way out of poverty is to join the Army. And then a large percentage of the poor do join. And then while in the Army, they acquire weapons and bomb training. These skills are in high demand by terrorists. If the soldier leaves the Army, terrorists pay well. So due to a lack of other high-paying jobs, joining the terrorist group is attractive. It makes sense. So it makes practical sense. So terrorists need skilled people, no matter their background. So the richer people leaving the Army have more legitimate employment opportunities. So can we say that poverty causes terrorism? No. It's not anger at government or their poor circumstances that may trigger their calculated choice to join a terror group and maximize income. It's to maximize their income. That's why they join. And so you have to yourself always, how can you validate your findings using these variables? So these are the things that you get involved with when trying to prove that the effect of something was caused by something else. What are some additional biases? And that there is a picture of Sheriff Moose, I believe his name is, and these were the D.C. snipers. We tend to believe, when it comes to big results, big cause, we tend to believe that big results must have big causes. For example, during the Cold War, many believed that only a nuclear attack could bring about the demise of the mighty Soviet Union. But in fact, it was less dramatic events, economic, that really brought about the fall. So that is another bias that could impact the analysis being conducted. It's always important to remember that. Let me jump. Fallacy of centralized direction. That's explained very clearly in the book as far as the failure to recognize questionable assumptions. I like group decision making. We're talking about groupthink. Most people, and I mean, and I'm a believer of this, that hey, two heads is better than one. But the reality is that group decision making is not always better than that of individuals. In some cases, it might be worse. And there's a phenomena called groupthink, and some of you might have heard this. And what it means is a mode of thinking that people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive group, when the members' strivings for unanimity override their motivation to realistically appraise all alternative courses of action. So in a nutshell, as they say, you know, that consensus, people want that consensus where everybody agrees. I like the example that they give, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which occurred during the Kennedy administration back in 1961. And Kennedy was a strong anti-communist. He wouldn't have got elected because of that. At the time, Cuba had experienced a revolution two years earlier, and so there was a lot of disconsternation within the United States of having a communist country that close to our shores. And so what essentially happened is the CI-backed group of Cuban exiles were put together and trained to do an invasion to see if they could take the island back. And when they were discussing this, many members of Kennedy's inner circle were quick to accept the most optimistic assumptions of the CIA and reject those that advised caution. Those individuals that fought back and said, hey, maybe this is not such a good idea, they became ostracized, and that's what happens in groupthink. If you're in that group and you don't join in with the consensus, then you become somewhat ostracized from the group, or ignored, so to speak, because you're not going along. And there were a few advisors that warned that the invasion was a bad idea, but they were ignored, their ideas were marginalized, and as a result, they even began to question themselves, as they talk about. But in the long run, it would have been better to listen to their ideas, because the Bay of Pigs invasion turned out to be a major disaster. And as a result, it was a tremendous embarrassment to the Kennedy administration. Much of it could be attributed to groupthink. And groupthink is that phenomena that can occur within groups when it becomes more important to give into the pressure and join that consensus, make that consensus decision. And rather than tell the boss what he needs to hear, they'll just go along with everyone else so they can be part of the group. And of course, with groupthink, you have censorship, self-censorship, and other things that occur. And when you look at the picture there, that was one of the problems too with the investigation relative to the DC snipers. Somebody had described a white van, and they put all their resources into finding that white van. Well, as it turned out, these guys were in a blue sedan. So think about, by jumping to that first what seemed to be a good lead or a good description of what they were driving and putting all your eggs in that basket, a lot of resources were wasted looking for a white van when in fact the individuals involved did not have a white van. And so what you have there is a situation where it was assumed they were in that white van and nobody questioned those assumptions. That's a very big part of barriers to analysis, is being able to question those assumptions that seem logical or based on the first information that's received. This slide is about bureaucratic barriers. It's important that intelligence is not politicized. It has to be objective. We know that in the 9/11 Commission, that was one of their biggest complaints, was the lack of information sharing, and that's something that the laws that were changed address those. In particular, the creation of the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence position, the creation of the National Counterterrorism Center. These are all things that were designed to enhance collaboration and improve information sharing, which is so critical to good, sound, non-politicized intelligence. And a lot of that is that what they call connecting the dots, and that's really what intelligence analysts do. And the 9/11 Commission found that they had failed to connect the dots, and a lot of that was caused by the fact that there was very little sharing of information, looking at the big picture. You also had a thing they called a wall, which was an administrative thing that was created within, in particular, the FBI, whereby for many years agents who worked national security matters were not permitted to discuss their cases with agents who were assigned to national security investigations unless certain conditions. So, to give you an example, let's say we have the same target. I'm working the criminal end because this person is involved in bank robberies. You're working the national security end because you think this person might be an Al-Qaeda operative. Well, because of this wall, this administrative wall between those two functions within the FBI that have been created, I couldn't talk to you about this person even though it might be the same person. It was crazy. It didn't make any sense. But that no longer exists. That wall was broken down after 9/11. And again, that's a cultural difference when you're dealing with there also is a cultural difference that emerges when you're dealing with people that are involved in espionage cases or intelligence versus criminal investigations. They use different words, different terminology. As a former criminal investigator, I never used the word tradecraft, which is a very common word within the agencies that are involved in intelligence and espionage, counter-espionage, etc. And the bottom line is, regardless of how much work is done, sometimes the dots can't be connected, and you're not going to resolve it. And but the good thing is that because of some of the changes that have been made within government, there's a lot better chance of stopping something like a 9/11. This is just a picture of, just to give you an idea, Operation Ghost Stories of the good work that's being done. And these were sleeper deep cover operatives who were Russians that were exposed. In 2010, they were arrested. They'd been placed in the United States by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. They had not been able to obtain classified information yet. They were here. They were working. Some were married. They had homes. The perfect, as they say in the textbook, Cold War spy novel. I mean, and essentially these two were. There was this, they were arrested, and they were swapped with the Russians for 4 Russian nationals who had been caught assisting the United States. Just remember that there are many potential barriers to good analysis. We've discussed some of them. There's a few in the book that I haven't talked about, but you need to review. It requires an extraordinary effort on the part of an analyst to overcome these biases, these psychological barriers, so they will do a good, non-politicized, objective analysis that'll benefit the requester or the leadership, the decision maker. Let me just look through here if there's anything else that I definitely need to cover. And some of the things we talked about, like the DC sniper, they'll come into more that we can discuss further when we get to Chapter 6 with analytical methods. And just remember, analysis defined. Intelligence analysis is the application of individual and collective cognitive methods to weigh data and test hypotheses within a secret socio-cultural context. It's a process. Information itself is not intelligence. Information has to be processed and shown to be valuable before it can become categorized intelligence. That's something we will cover again later too, as we go through the intelligence cycle in another chapter. And don't forget, it's always that need to know. It's important to protect the information that we have, and only the people in the different agencies that have a need to know should have access. The use of analytical methods as we go into the next chapter. This is a very important chapter. I wish this was a lecture class, because in the lecture class we actually do a lot of exercises that relate directly to this. But at the same time, we'll just have to deal with what we have to deal with, and you look at it from on an online class. It'll be more of introducing you to to how the methods are used, and you will have an opportunity in a written practical exercise to apply what you've learned. And you know, the intelligence community, they realize that they have to do a better job analyzing the information they receive. Most intelligence failures, as our textbook says, relate to the failure of analysis. It's not collection. And analytical requirements will become even more complicated in the future as we deal with greater amounts of information and technology. Sure, data mining and other computer programs, they help quite a bit, but when you boil it all down, analysis is best carried out by a human being. And as we've seen, human beings have mindsets, preconceptions, biases, things that we discussed in the prior chapter that must be overcome, especially if they're going to do analytical work. And so when we look at improving our all-source intelligence, vetting our resources, improving the capabilities of our analysts, all of these things, when put together, show a great deal of efforts being put to improve the final product. Structured analytical techniques is one of the things that they're addressing to try to look for uniformity, and also these are designed to overcome those biases and those preconceptions that exist in our genes and our being that have to be overcome to be effective. So that's kind of what this chapter is about, some of the things we'll talk about. Critical thinking as defined, and that's where a thinker, and you hear this a lot in college, employers need critical thinkers, and that's one of the traits that if you have is very sought after in business, in law enforcement, in government, wherever you would have a desire to work. It's thinking that improves the quality of thinking, if that makes sense. You're improving the quality of your own thinking by analyzing, assessing, reconstructing. It's done to help understanding. It takes time, and many times imagination is important, and thinking outside the box, thinking beyond what the normal thought processes might be on a topic. Another key issue is collaboration. It's encouraged, especially in the intelligence community today. Now we have to watch for groupthink, etc., but that's many times that may occur. Well, it can occur in the analytical stage, but also at the leadership stage. But still, sharing information, collaborating between departments, between agencies, not doing things like the FBI did when we talked about the wall before, where the criminal investigators couldn't talk to the espionage agents, those sort of things, those administrative things that clog the ability to provide an unbiased, valuable product to the decision maker. Collaboration also, they talk about Intellipedia, which is a classification tool now used by analysts that it improves rapid sharing of ideas. So these are all great things that are being used today to improve the product. one of the key things is structured analytical techniques. And those are our cognitive methods that they talk about to improve the analytical process. A key assumptions check, and we're going to have an example here in a minute. And what we do there is we challenge our assumptions. What can be assumed, the best way to do that is with the samples I'll give you. We'll talk about structured brainstorming, the analysis of competing hypotheses, scenario planning. I've added one called starbursting. We also have devil's advocate, red hat analysis, contrarian methods. And so let's look at a few of those. Structured brainstorming is usually used at the beginning of a project. It's a group process, follows specific rules, and it's used to identify relevant variables and driving forces, potential scenarios, and outcomes and information sources. A true structured brainstorming exercise that I teach in my lecture class is, let's say you give a requirement to a team of individuals, and they're looking for perhaps driving forces that impact that requirement. Maybe they're looking for scenario generation, how this thing may play out. Try to identify indicators, or indicators is the term that I use. In the book they use milestones that would tell you whether something is coming true. But normally the way it works is people would sit at a table. I like to give them each a pad of sticky notes, and they write what comes to their mind. They don't discuss things, they just write. And usually within 5 or 10 minutes, people run out of ideas. You take all those ideas, you put them on a board with the sticky notes, and then as a group you go through and you categorize them, put them in different classifications as to where ideas are similar. And from that, you can get some great ideas on how to proceed. You're brainstorming ideas based on the challenge. It's a and most of you have done that. It's just you just didn't know what it was called. And you really won't see this discussed in the text, but I did want to bring that out. At least not discussed to the level that I like to discuss it. This is not in the text also. This is something I taught when I'm teaching intelligence overseas to law enforcement and law enforcement and military people within the national security police agencies and the intelligence groups that I've been involved with. Starbursting is where you just a form of brainstorming focused on generating questions. Who did what? Who, what, where, when, how. These are all questions that need to be answered, and that can be done in a brainstorming session to help you further identify what the problem is, perhaps what the solutions are, or trying to understand what happened with an event. Here's just a diagram of a starbursting diagram of a lethal biological event at a subway station. Who? Has any group threatened such an attack? So we're getting together. You've had a bio attack at a subway, and the analysts are getting together, and they're trying to figure out exactly what happened. Has any group threatened? Could it have occurred by accident? What was used? Could it cause injuries? How? How was the agent dispersed? Did the perpetrators have to be present? And you go around the wheel, the various prongs on the starfish that you see, and based on asking those questions, you can develop information that can help lead, in this case, to the perpetrator. These are structured techniques in the sense that you follow a structure, and if everybody does it the same way, then hopefully the products will be consistent. A good example they talk about, this is David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. Koresh was the leader of the Branch Davidians, which was a cult in Waco, Texas. He was under investigation by the FBI and the ATF for various things, but in particular weapons, having unlawful weapons, automatic weapons on their property. They actually had an arrest warrant for him. Rather than wait for him to come in town, they decided to try to execute it on his property. Now, he had many people in his cult living with him at this property. I've attached a film clip. You can take a look at it. They ended up going into a siege. In the initial assault on the compound, There was a lot of shooting that went along. Some of the agents were killed, in particular ATF agents. 5 Branch Davidians were killed, and then they went into the siege or standoff for 51 days. And eventually the FBI managers on scene, the ATF had started it out, FBI came in once the thing really got into a siege situation. After 51 days, the FBI decided to inject tear gas into the compound, thinking that the mothers would not allow their children to suffer through the event, and they would come out, and eventually they would drive the mothers and the children out of the building, and all that would be left would be the hardcore followers, when hopefully they could enter and take control and arrest these individuals. But that's not what happened. What ultimately happened was a fire began. The entire place went up in flames, and all the women, children, Branch Davidians were killed that were inside. And so what you have to do is you go into a key assumption check, and essentially what happened was the Branch Davidian, or excuse me, the FBI, they assumed that in the face of the tear gas, etc., that the mothers would not allow their children to suffer, and that they would come out and surrender. And they assumed wrong, because these people were so dedicated to Koresh that they would rather die in the fire and in the flames than give in to the government. And so again, the FBI, had they done a better key assumptions check, they should have looked at they figured, hey, this is the way they're going to react, but they really underestimated their devotion to Koresh, and as a result, the situation became very, very bad, and all the people were killed that were inside. And what was even more unfortunate later on, Tim McVeigh, who was the one of the 2 people involved in the Oklahoma City bombing, this particular event really upset him and was critical in stimulating him to engage in a terrorist attack with the explosion. So a lot of the militia groups, far right-wing groups, were very, very upset at the government for what happened here with Koresh and the Branch Davidians. Next slide. And this is just what the key assumptions would have looked like. Key assumption was the cult leader's a con man, and the assessment in reality is likely, yeah, he was a con man. However, the FBI underestimated the commitment, so they should be looking at both sides of this issue, trying to figure out before they make a final decision. The mother and fathers will not allow their children to suffer. Well, that was wrong. They did allow their children to suffer the gas attack, and allowed them to be shot at close range rather than die in the fire. Cult members will convince the leader to let the women and children surrender. Possible. That was possible, but he was the Messiah to them. They would ascend straight to heaven if they endured the gas attack and the fire, which he had prophesied. And then the entire cult would rather surrender, except for those who are wanted. Well, obviously their devotion to him was much different. In this slide, we're going to do a review of the analysis of competing hypotheses, which is another structured analytical technique. And I've seen this used quite frequently, and it's very, very effective. A hypothesis, what is a hypothesis? A statement or conclusion. It can be disproved. It's similar to a doctor performing a diagnosis of somebody who's sick. It flows from questions policymakers want answered. Be specific. Goal is to disprove. Actually, your goal in a hypothesis is to disprove it. If you can disprove it, then you know it's not true. Now, when we look at this particular hypothesis, we have an investigation. We have law enforcement has done an investigation relative to a crime that has occurred. And so 3 hypotheses have been generated. The perpetrator lived in the same neighborhood. the perpetrator lived in the same town but a different neighborhood, and the perpetrator lived far from the victim in another town or state. And so we're looking at in this particular hypothesis, the investigators, they want to know exactly, whether this guy's a local guy or whether he's somebody that lives somewhere else. So that's what they're trying to determine by going through this process. Now, when you look at the chart, these are the facts and evidence that were found. Bloody barefoot print left at the scene, no attempt to wash up, aware of a single female and location, source information of questionable reliability stated the attack similar to one out of state in the past month. So this is information that they've developed that they're going to try to use in their analysis. Now, as you look at the column, C stands for credibility. In other words, what's the credibility of the information? I stands for the impact it would have based on the evidence that's found. What kind of impact would it have relative to the hypothesis? So if we go to hypothesis 1, we look at the bloody barefoot, and then let me back up. If you look at the bottom, you have a Likert scale to evaluate strongly supports down to strongly refutes the evidence, and our credibility and impact evaluations are high, medium, and low. So we've established those criteria in putting together our chart. So again, C is credibility, I is impact. So for hypothesis 1, perpetrator lived in the same neighborhood. The analyst here showed that that would support the bloody barefoot left at the scene would support that the perpetrator lived in the same neighborhood. In other words, the guy's barefoot. Who's going to come from out of town that's barefoot going into a house to either rape and murder somebody and break into their apartment? Then we go down. No attempt to wash up. That strongly supports that he's local, because we have a person that comes in, rapes and murders somebody, there's a lot of blood around. Many times they will wash up at the scene. Aware of single female location for hypothesis 1. That would be very strongly support. Okay? And then source information, that would refute it. If somebody says it's out of state, that would refute the hypothesis that the perpetrator lived in the same neighborhood. Now, don't forget, that was hypothesis 1 column. Let me go to the left here for a minute and look at our credibility. For bloody barefoot print, that's high. The credibility is high because the police found it, the investigator. No attempt to wash up, that's a high credibility because the investigators when they did the search of the house, they found no attempts, no blood in the sink or anything. Aware of a single female location in the apartment. Based on the credibility of that information, it was assigned a medium. And low for the source of information, questionable reliability stated attacks similar to one out of the past. So that's low because that's somebody they can't validate that information is good. Impact, bloody barefoot print was evaluated as being medium impact to support the hypothesis. No attempt to wash up, high, aware of single female. You can read these charts pretty easy. Let's go to hypothesis 2, which is perpetrator lived in the same town but different neighborhood. If we look at that, you'll have a bloody barefoot, again, plus supports it. Hypothesis, no attempt to wash up. That's support. They give it a single support, not a highly support. Aware of single female location, no effect. And then source information of questionable reliability strongly refutes. Okay? And so what essentially is they put this chart together, and if you look at the chart, which hypothesis do you think that the police judged the most likely? Would be 1. Hypothesis 1, that he lived in the same neighborhood based on the evidence that they had. And second, hypothesis 2 would be the second one that was closest to that. So this is how you would do a analysis of competing hypotheses. Multiple scenario generation, that's just another technique where it's a framework for considering multiple and plausible futures. You identify driving forces that would impact the projected scenarios, you classify them, you examine your assumptions, and depending on the situation, they may deliver a warning. And they also, this multiple scenario generation also communicates complex ideas. Obviously, if somebody had, this is a picture of the Madrid train bombing, obviously if somebody had predicted that, they would have had much more security on rapid transit that day in Madrid. I put this map in strictly. You've got a writing assignment, a practical exercise to do. You'll use this as a point of reference since the exercise deals with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. This is just an example of multiple scenario generation. In this particular one, of the future of the Iraq insurgency. What are the drivers? You identify key drivers as you try to develop. So when you look at that cross, those cross lines, each one of those, it sets up 4 quadrants. Think of that. And so in each one of those quadrants, you'll come up with a scenario that you think would fit that quadrant. So then you fill out the A, the role of neighboring states, Syria and Iran, would be your x-axis. B, the capability of Iraq security forces would be your b-axis. And then C, the political environment. So you create 3 here. We have 3 matrices that we can fill in scenario generations within each one. That's how it's done. And here's one where we actually put in some of the scenarios. We have the 2 that we're using. In this case, this would involve future of the Iraq insurgency using spectrums to define potential outcomes. In other words, outcomes or scenario generation. Our drivers are Iraqi security capability on the X and the helpfulness of neighbors on the Y-axis. Okay, so then you would go into each one of the quadrants, and you would base your scenario generation on what you see there. On one end of the scale, 2 on the X is the ineffective security. On the far right end, it would be effective. And on the bottom would be neighboring states are unstable or disruptive. At the top, so you have the 2 spectrums on each ends of your X and Y. Then based on those spectrums, you would then create your multiple scenarios. So you would brainstorm and come up with scenarios that fit that quadrant. So let's look at quadrant on the top left. In this one, we have at this end of the spectrum, ineffective security capability, and the neighboring states are stable and supportive. So the regional defensive umbrella secures the borders, and then another insurgency is pure Sunni internal political solution. That's a question mark. Go to the other side. Effective security capability and neighboring states stable and supportive. Militias integrated into new Iraqi army. Jordan brokers deal economic aid to Sunnis. These are just possible scenarios how they do it. Okay, I'm just showing you the process. You don't have to know what's in this chart. And this is just another chart showing the various. As you can see, depending on how many drivers you can come up with scenario generations in each one of those quadrants. You'll have multiple scenarios that are possible, and then eventually you go through a process of picking out the ones that are the most sensible. Again, that's all about scenario planning, where team members envision any number of different possibilities, regardless of how implausible they seem, until they come up with a list of what they think are the most likely. And the driving forces or the drivers are the trends that will likely affect the issue that you're studying. And then ultimately you'll have what they call milestones or indicators, and they tell you whether what you predicted is actually going to come true. Again, indicators and milestones are observable phenomena, and they enhance the credibility of the analysis. This is an example, milestone or indicator sample of a clandestine meth drug lab. Analysis predict a clandestine drug lab is in operation. These are the indicators to determine whether the analysis is correct. And these would be indicators that you would notice. So they're predicting if there's a clandestine drug lab operating, a meth lab in the area. And these are the things if you see, if somebody reports noxious odors, all windows darkened or covered at a house that might be under suspicion, different things that would indicate whether a drug lab, a meth lab is in operation. These are what you would call indicators. In our book, they call them milestones.